On this day in 1901 and again in 1902 and for a third time in 1903, April the 22nd would become one of the many infamous dates as a phantom menace proved to be both alive and on the loose amongst the population of Brisbane. Involving a spectre that would hang over the region for 9 long years, from April 1900 through until 1909, the occurrences would send shivers down the spine of every man, woman and child as they went about their daily routines. For many, the mention of the bubonic plague, or the Black Death as it has become popularly known due to acral gangrene causing body extremities and skin to dye and turn black, thoughts and images of Middle Ages Europe are often conjured. In what has been deemed the second pandemic, the bubonic plague would ravage Central Asia and Europe through the middle and late 1300s, resulting in the death of an estimated 1/3 of the human population, or over 100 million people. An infection of the lymphatic system, the disease is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transferred through either contact with plague-affected individuals or more commonly via the bite of fleas and lice that have fed from infected rodents. Whilst the Middle Ages European outbreak of the Black Death has been widely popularised over the last couple of centuries, fewer know about the third pandemic of the disease, originating again in Asia in the late 1800s and quickly spreading to shipping ports around the globe due to infected rats in the holds of cargo vessels. Unfortunately, Australia and Brisbane were not immune to the outbreak. Brisbane would experience its first brush with the bubonic plague on the 19th of April 1900, when a sick water rat was discovered languishing in an office wash basin within one of the shipping companies on the wharves. Gingerly transferred to the government bacteriologist, the rat was discovered to be carrying a particularly virulent strain of the Yersinia bacteria. Of greater concern, the rodent was also found to be infested with fleas, all of which were carrying the disease. Within days, on the 25th of April, a second sickly rat was captured within a state school classroom at Kangaroo Point. It too was found to be carrying the plague bacteria, and an immediate closure of the district schools was ordered. However, by the 27th of April, the first reported human case of the plague was reported in Brisbane, being that of a 21-year-old drayman by the name of James Drevison. A resident of Hawthorne Street, Woolloongabba, Drevison was employed as a carter between the wharves and the markets. Immediately transferred to the newly established quarantine hospital at Cairncross House in Colmslie, Drevison's residents and family were also placed in lockdown. Panic across the suburb ensued when it was discovered that Drevison had been suffering from symptoms for over 3 days prior to his enforced quarantine, all the while moving about the city. However, the month of April, and especially the date of the 22nd, would recur over the next 3 years in relation to new bubonic plague cases. In 1901, on the morning of the 22nd of April, reports were published in the Brisbane newspapers of an additional case of plague uncovered at the Colmslie Plague Hospital. Unlike the other ailing patients in the facility who had contracted the infection whilst going about their business further afield in Brisbane, the patient in question had contracted the disease within the hospital itself. Nurse Nelson, who had been charged with caring for plague patients, had suddenly taken ill 36 hours earlier with very suspicious symptoms. Her condition growing worse through the night and into the next day, she was immediately administered a curative serum, resulting in the partial abatement of her raging fever. However, a positive diagnosis of plague was passed down by the facility's medical staff. Nurse Nelson would remain a quarantine patient within her own hospital through until the recovery and discharge on the 18th of May. It would be surmised that her infection had been passed on through a mosquito bite. On the 22nd of April 1902, another supposed case of plague would make the papers in Brisbane. It would be reported that John Maynard, the licensee of the Lamington Hotel on George Street in Brisbane, had died as a result of the plague, a report that would be republished in papers across Queensland over the next few days. However, on digging through the records of the day, the case presents as very suspicious for a suspected plague death. According to John Maynard's death notice, as published in the Brisbane Courier on the 26th of April, the hotelier had died within the confines of the Lamington Hotel due to heart failure. Yet, not a skerrick of evidence exists suggesting the establishment was either quarantined or sterilised, which was strict practice for any dwelling suspected of carrying the infection. Further, Maynard's funeral notice invites all acquaintances to his burial at Toowong Cemetery, despite strict regulations on the interment of plague victims, and his grave was subsequently reopened in 1923 for a further family interment, despite regulations that plague graves be marked as never to be reopened. Finally, on the 22nd of April 1903, yet another plague case would grace the print media's headlines. The steamer Tyrian had just docked at the Howard Smith wharves on the Brisbane River, unloading a bumper cargo of 153 crates of bananas from Geraldton in Western Australia, which had been transshipped at the port of Townsville. By the time the government health department officials arrived to inspect the cargo, the shipment sitting on the wharf had been reduced to a meagre 22 crates, the remainder having already been passed on to various merchants across Brisbane for consumption. Amidst the remaining cases, 46 dead rats were discovered, some of which were tested and found to be carrying the plague bacteria. Needless to say, the final 22 crates of cargo were immediately seized with frantic orders that they be destroyed at once. However, the missing 131 potentially plague-carrying crates were never recovered. From 1909, after considerable rat eradication programs and public sanitation campaigns, Brisbane would see out 12 plague-free years on the back of 219 deaths across wider Queensland. An additional outbreak in 1921 would see a further 12 months of the plague overhang Brisbane, with the loss of an additional 63 lives before finally being brought under control in 1922.